Dobar dan, pratite još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Danas u malo drugačijem izdanju i na drugačijoj lokaciji. Nalazimo se u rezidenciji britanske ambasadorke u Crnoj Gori, gospođe Karen Maddocks, koja je i moj današnji sagovornik. Ambassador Maddocks, thank you very much for being our guest today and for taking your time for Gradska television.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to host you here.
Thank you. So, what's your assessment of the current situation in Montenegro?
I think the current situation is very worrying. We have several of Montenegro's institutions which are not functioning. There is a caretaker government headed by a prime minister who lost a confidence vote 6 months ago now, and several significant pieces of legislation or policy have been passed despite the government acting in only a caretaker capacity. And none of the decisions that the government is making can be challenged in the Constitutional Court while it's not operational. And so this means that the checks and balances that allow a democratic government to function in the interests of its people are just missing. And this makes Montenegro more vulnerable to influence from external states like Russia, for example, and also open to influence from serious and organized crime.
There are appeals from all Western addresses, from Brussels to the UK to the USA, to elect the judges of the Constitutional Court as soon as possible. In Montenegro itself, the non-governmental sector says that they are skeptical about election of all 4 judges, and that 1 or 2 judges could eventually be elected. What would that mean for Montenegro?
Well, I think the most important priority has to just be to get the Constitutional Court functional again. And in that respect, I don't think speculation about how many judges will be elected is the most important factor. But I think we should be honest here. Montenegro needs to show its partners, as a NATO ally, as a prospective EU state, that it is completely capable of functioning normally, and that means having the capability to fill its own judicial positions whenever they become vacant. And that should be a fundamental norm for any state.
Commenting on the messages that come from the addresses of Western partners, Acting Prime Minister Dritan Abazovic repeats that he does not see anything worrying or alarming in them. Do you think that our Western partners speak too diplomatically, or that they are not direct enough, and that is why Mr. Abazovic does not see what the opposition sees in those messages?
Well, I think the UK has been very direct in its messages, and in fact, just now in this interview, I've said how concerned I am by this situation. So I think I've been very clear. And actually, most recently, our special envoy for this region, Lord Peach, he gave a statement that was 2 weeks ago, I think, and he was very clear that Montenegro is vulnerable now during this geopolitically challenging time. And he set out very clear expectations of what needs to happen next to get the Constitutional Court functional again, and to make sure the conditions were right to hold presidential and parliamentary elections. And he also said that our future cooperation with Montenegro would depend on continued alignment with our shared NATO values. And I think that's pretty clear.
Mm-hmm. The ambassadors of the Queen countries, which includes the country whose diplomatic representative you are in Podgorica, have repeatedly publicly supported the minority government led by Mr. Dritan Abazovic. Considering that this government brought Montenegro to institutional collapse, to quote the envoy Escobar, or to quote the head of diplomacy of Slovenia, Tanja Fajon, from a leading country in the EU accession process to the country with problems. Do you think that your support for that government was a mistake?
The UK government's position has not actually changed throughout the changes of government. We do not favour a particular government over another. We never support a particular government over another. You will remember that we worked well with Krivo Kapic's government. We worked well with Abazovic's government. And in fact, we worked really well with the DPS governments that came before that. And that's because we work with states, not governments. We don't choose the government, the Montenegrin people do. But we have diplomatic relations and we work with whichever government is in power. And that's what diplomats do. So it's not about support. And just because we speak to lots of people, that doesn't mean we're supporting them. It means that we're doing our job. We're finding out what's going on locally, and we are engaging with them.
Mm-hmm. Since it is not a member of the EU, how much is your country interested in stability of our region?
Well, Lord Peach made very clear in his statement 2 weeks ago that the UK has an unwavering commitment to the security and the prosperity of this region, including Montenegro. The UK has left the EU, but we are very much still part of Europe. We are a European neighbour to Montenegro, and we are your NATO ally. And the stability of this region is key to the stability of our entire shared continent. This is a really important region for us right now. And I think both of our countries, both the UK and Montenegro, have experienced hostile actions from Russia in the recent past. And that means we both have an interest in supporting countries, supporting each other, who are tackling Russia's influence. So, of course, we are deeply interested and very concerned about the stability of this region.
Some domestic and regional analysts and journalists are known to say that the political and diplomatic representatives of our Western partners are often benevolent towards the violation of European values and principles in the countries of this region. I want to say that you are resented of tolerating the destabilization of the countries of the region, and that destabilization comes from the same address, from Belgrade and the president of Serbia, Mr. Aleksandar Vučić. How do you respond to these types of criticism?
Well, I think actually the UK has been very clear about its values here in the region, in Montenegro, and on the world stage. And if you look at Ukraine, the UK has always been one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine. We had President Zelensky was in London yesterday, in fact, and our Prime Minister and President Zelensky signed a bilateral agreement. And I think that shows just how much we support Ukraine and how much we want to support them in their fight against Russia's illegal and unprovoked war. I think our values are really clear. And if you look at my statements from the embassy, you will see a common thread throughout that we are actively supporting Montenegro as a NATO ally, also facing threats from Russia. And our cooperation is strong here precisely because we work together to promote Euro-Atlantic values. I'm the representative of the UK government here, so of course everything I do is promoting those values and principles. And any suggestion otherwise, any suggestion that our values differ from that is disinformation. And we know that is rife in this region and in this country. And a lot of it is put out there deliberately to discredit us, probably because they see the UK, they see Western partners as a threat.
Mm-hmm. Seen from the perspective of the UK, is there an agreement between Brussels and Washington when it comes to the way and methods of solving problems in countries of this region?
Well, that's not something that I've been involved in or the UK's been involved in. But I can say in Montenegro, and actually in the wider region, the UK actually works very closely with Brussels and with Washington, with all our Euro-Atlantic partners. We don't have an agreement on our positions, but we do coordinate very, very closely on our policies and on our positions.
Mm-hmm. Presidential elections are scheduled for March 19th. Will these elections stabilize the crisis in Montenegro? What do you think?
Well, I think the elections are due at the end of the president's mandate, so they have to happen on time. If they don't happen on time, that will be another example of a departure from constitutional norms, so it's important that they happen. But holding the elections and potentially electing a new president is not going to bring stability in itself. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done for that to happen.
If, hypothetically speaking, the judges of the Constitutional Court are not elected, and therefore the presidential elections are not held, and the president's mandate expires. The Constitution prescribes that the President of the Assembly, Danijela Đurović, takes over the position of President of the state. What does this concentration of power in the hands of parties mean? And when I ask you this, I mean about parties which, judging by the results of the last local elections, barely passed the census.
Well, I think if the role of the president is not filled by democratic means, then this would represent a further deterioration of the checks and balances required for a democratic state. It would be worrying. So it's why, alongside Quint ambassadors, we have spoken so much about the vital importance of filling those constitutional court positions and for the court to be functional again, so that elections can take place and the institutions can be, the positions in the institutions can be filled in a constitutional and democratic way.
Do you expect extraordinary parliamentary elections to be announced soon?
I think in Montenegro we should always expect the unexpected. Whether or not elections are announced, I mean, that's a decision for the elected representatives of your people, your parliament, but I hope they will be. The Prime Minister has been in a caretaker capacity now for 6 months, and the parliamentary majority has failed to find the consensus they need to form a new government. So elections have to be the next logical option if that hasn't happened. But as I say, we expect the unexpected, so let's see.
Yeah. The parliamentary majority announces a new attempt to reconstruct the existing government, which would imply the entry of the pro-Russian Democratic Front, which the EU opposes. Would your country support that government?
Well, this question goes back to what I talked about earlier, and that's that the UK works with states and not governments. Our position would be the same. We work with whichever government has been democratically elected. It doesn't mean we support them. We continue to have diplomatic relations, and the level and tone of our cooperation will depend on how much we share interests and values, and those would be Euro-Atlantic interests and values. And I think Lord Peach also said this really well, and just to quote him again, he says, as NATO allies, it is particularly important that we maintain clear shared values underpinning our aligned position across defence, security and foreign policy, and it's only on the basis of such interests, shared interests, that our successful cooperation continues. So I think that answers your question about whether we would work with a future government depending on what it looked like.
Okay. So for the end of this show, I would like to ask you something about media scene in Montenegro. As you probably know, the media scene in Montenegro is in a kind of domination and occupation by media from Serbia that promote the thesis of Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and openly support political parties in Montenegro that are under his influence. After the local elections in Podgorica on October 23rd last year, the winning coalition, primarily the candidate for mayor, Mr. Jakov Milatovic, continuously threatens to replace the management and the council members of Gradska television, openly announcing, and I quote, revanchism. Is there a mechanism by which the journalists and editors of the only media that is not under the influence of Moscow and Belgrade would be protected from the open attacks of the candidate for mayor for Podgorica, Mr. Jakov Milatovic, and his coalition partners?
So I think at the heart of his question, what it comes down to is whether you have the mechanisms here to challenge decisions made by people in authority. At the moment, the mechanisms here are not sufficient. And that's because these mechanisms, they should exist. It's the judiciary. If your judiciary is not functioning properly, if you don't have the right people in the right appointments from the highest level, people cannot access justice and they cannot challenge the decisions of their governments. You know, if something like the situation you just described, if there was something like that happened in the UK, you could, if you were afraid of losing your job for political reasons, you could take your employer to court and you could get a fair hearing and a decision would be made based on the facts. So obviously I can't make, you know, a judgment on the situation you've just described because I don't have all the information. But you need a judge who can listen to that information and make a decision. And that's what is lacking here, a credible judiciary. And that's the mechanism that you need.
And that brings us to the beginning of this interview and the functional
The constitutional courts,
yeah,
of course, yes.
Well, Ambassador Maddocks, thank you very much for your time to be our guest, to be the guest of Gradska Television.
It's been a pleasure, thank you.
Thank you again. Uvaženi gledalci, poštovani slušalci, pratili ste još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Moje ime je Bojana Dabovića, moja današnja sagovornica bila je britanska ambasadorka u Crnoj Gori, Karen Maddocks. Hvala vam na pažnji i želim vam ugodan ostatak dana. Prijetno.